Friend? Friend?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special bonus episode of Citizen Dame. And we had a fun time this month because when we put up the poll for our bonus episodes, everything was tied. The Patreon poll, the Twitter poll, every single poll keeps, and like we were watching it, we were just like, oh my God, it keeps on being tied. So we decided that we're going to do two episodes this month. We're going to do the two films that were running neck and neck constantly and finally wound up being tied. And also they're great films, so that'll be fun. So we're going to start off with Bride of Frankenstein, which is the fantastic film from 1935. I almost said 1933 for some reason. I think that's Invisible Man. That's one of James Whale's earlier films. But yeah, so Bride of Frankenstein is the sequel, obviously, to the 1931 film Frankenstein. And in a lot of circles, it's considered to be the better film, actually. It's definitely the more polished film. And it has, I think it gets a lot more extreme in a lot of ways, which is a bit surprising given that it's a 1935 film. So it's post-code, whereas the original film, the 31 film, is pre-code. So they had a lot more flexibility in what they could get away with in the 31 film, yet the 35 film, I think in a lot of ways is wilder, it's stranger, it's more like aesthetically defined, it's more perverse. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, which we will get into in a minute. But first of all, Karen, hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. I'm excited. I love
Are
this
you?
movie.
Because I wasn't sure.
I love this movie so much. Every time I watch it, I'm like, oh, this is such a good movie. Why don't movies like this get made anymore?
That is a great question. Why don't they?
Also, this is an hour and like 15-minute film. I have to
Yeah.
say that. This is
Yeah.
this is not a long horror movie. This is very spare in a lot of ways.
It doesn't waste time. It doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't. It just gets to the point. It doesn't waste a lot of time.
It does. It plunges you right in, actually.
Hmm.
So why don't we take a page from its book and plunge right in? First of all, I mean, I think that most people know the plot of this movie, so it takes place literally directly after the events of Frankenstein. So the windmill has collapsed. Like we pick up with the windmill having collapsed. That's where the
Yeah.
movie begins. The
Like
windmill
it's
has
still
collapsed.
smoldering.
Yeah, they think they've killed the monster. They think that Frankenstein himself is dead, the doctor, not the
Hmm.
monster. And then it turns out that Frankenstein has actually survived, and they carry him back home, where his bride is waiting for him, played by Valerie Hobson, and Frankenstein again is played by Colin Clive. Um, and then what eventually transpires is that not only was Frankenstein not killed, but the monster was not killed, and the monster is still at large. He begins moving across the countryside. He's injured, he's scared, he doesn't really know what is happening. Meanwhile, back at Castle Frankenstein, Frankenstein himself is visited by Dr. Pretorius, who is not a character in the first film, but shows up, was used to be at the university where Frankenstein went to university, and essentially makes a proposal to Frankenstein to create life with him, right? So Pretorius claims that he's discovered a way to create life, but his problem is that he can't get size. He can't get he can't create a creature big enough, right? He can only create these little homunculus figures. Whereas
Oh, neat.
Frankenstein understands how to create life out of death, right? And so Pretorius wants him to kind of wants them to unite and create a bride, create a woman. Uh, and it's wild and bizarre, but I wanted to start out with like, Karen, what do you think of this movie? I've already said that I love it, so I want you to go ahead and talk about what your feelings are about it.
Oh, I love it too, and I definitely am one of those that feels like this is better than the first one, the 1931 film. And one of the reasons is because I feel like this um, taps into some of the things I love so much from the book that got completely cut out of the original film. Um, like this friendship he develops with this blind man in the woods, and then the whole
Yeah.
concept of the bride and giving him a companion. That's such an important part of the book that had nothing to do with the first movie. So that's I the novel is one of my very favorite books ever, and so I think that's why I love Bride of Frankenstein so much, is because it just feels to me, even though it's still very different, even though there's still a lot of major differences, it just feels to me like it captures more of the essence of what makes the novel so great.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And in some ways, the two films act as a single entity, a single adaptation of Frankenstein. And
Yeah.
they go off book a lot, obviously. But but yeah, because you get a lot more of that. You get Elizabeth, the importance of Elizabeth as a character. You get the bride. You get more of the monster's kind of pathos. Because in the
Mm-hmm.
first film, he's very um, he's mute, right? He can't speak. In this film, he learns how to speak, and I think we'll talk about that in a minute. But you get more of the fact that he really is a victim, right? He's not monstrous. He's not evil. He's taught to be monstrous and he's taught to be evil by the way that people treat him. But he's not born bad. In fact, one of the things I really like about Bride of Frankenstein is that it shows that he's actually good. Like
Mm-hmm.
he wants to do good. His initial impulses are all good. The One of the initial scenes with the monster, which kind of makes up the middle part of the film, is he frightens a young woman who falls into a creek, and he jumps in to try to save her. And then she begins screaming because she sees him, and he tries to like silence her. So he is this child basically, but he's a massive child. He's a frightening child. But his immediate impulse is to rescue her, right? His immediate impulse is always to be good and to do good things. And then the way that people react to him is that you're frightening, you're monstrous, you're evil, including his own creator, who refuses to even be in the same room with him.
Right.
And I really like that Bride of Frankenstein actually goes into that, which is a major element of the novel, that the monster is not born bad. The monster is taught to be bad because he's treated badly in return.
Right. Yeah, and he's one that in the original story, a big part of the reason why he is alone and isolated is because he's rejected by his creator, who, in senses, just based on how creation works, is kind of his mother and his father. So it's like being rejected by his parents, tossed out into the lonely world. And what other, how is he supposed to learn um, how to navigate society? He can't. And then he's got this monstrous form, and so people are automatically afraid of him. And and it's that loneliness and the constant fear that he receives um, that turn him into essentially this monster. And I think that this film really does a good job of, like you say, showing that at his heart he's good, and you see that in things like the scene with the old man, and this beautiful friendship they have, and how much he loves music, and he wants to learn, he craves knowledge, he thirsts for it.
Yeah, he wants to learn how to speak. He wants
Mm-hmm.
to learn how to express himself. And he embraces, and he shows that he's able to learn that as well. He
Right.
embraces it. He's not the first film. I think in a lot of ways treats him as this dumb monstrosity, right?
Yeah.
This walking corpse, basically. And the second film really goes into the fact that he's not bad. What his problem is that he looks bad. The problem is that he looks monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what kind of pushes, and then he responds in the way that, he's essentially a very large 3-year-old. So, if a very large 3-year-old
Mm-hmm.
is always being pushed, and he's going to push back, right? That's the only
Yeah.
thing that he knows how to do. But if he's being treated with kindness, then he's going to respond with kindness.
Well, and similar to a toddler, they don't have language yet. And so when they have feelings, whether they're positive or negative, they don't have the language to communicate that. And so for him, for the monster, when he is sad or scared or just trying to help, he doesn't have a way to communicate that to anybody. So everything he does, because he's big and scary looking, is interpreted as something dangerous and terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that this kind of leads into one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is Karloff's performance in this film. And I don't know if
I
it was
love
just
that he's credited just as Karloff.
which was the style, like in like throughout his early career at Universal. That was how he was credited. He was never credited as Boris Karloff. He was credited as Karloff. Like that was what he was, right? And it's really hilarious when you actually know Boris Karloff's background, because he's like from London. He's English. He's like this sort of slight, uh, gaunt figure who's like, he's not at all terrifying when you actually look at Boris Karloff without all of the makeup and everything. You're just like, oh, you seem like a really nice dude. He had a lisp, like,
I mean, his
that.
real name was William Henry Pratt.
Yeah, he's just like, he's actually really adorable. And it's always funny that like his big roles, are these monsters, and particularly the monster, right? um I I mean, I don't know if it was just my mood in rewatching this film this time around, but I was really moved by his performance. Um, this particular like instance when I was rewatching the film, and I think that that whole sequence with the blind man really is incredibly touching.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is Karloff's body language, because the monster for a long time, and he's able to speak a few words throughout the film, but for the most part he speaks in grunts and moans. And he's been through it, right? He's been treated with nothing but hatred and contempt. He's been imprisoned, he's been beaten, he's been shot, he's been tied up. Pretty much the only thing that he has experienced his entire life has been hatred. And he comes across this man who can't see him, and so who can't react to him in a horrified way. And he learns what friendship is. He learns that there's something else other than hatred out there. And that really influences even his reactions to everything that happens throughout the rest of the film, even though ultimately he is driven away from the blind man's house as well. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I agree with you. I think that the humanity, and this is, I feel like I've been using that word so much recently, just in general, like looking for the humanity in people. I guess it's something I'm just trying to do better about. But yeah, it's really beautifully shown here. I think one of the things that stood out to me this time was, and it's been a while since I've watched it, and I'm sure I have not watched it nearly as many times as you have. But I guess it was sort of a Mandela effect thing. I don't know if I ever really paid that much attention to how little you actually see the bride in The Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, no, she's in like one scene, and she's there for maybe
Yeah.
3 minutes.
Yeah, she's there for like the final 3 or 4
Yeah.
minutes of the entire movie. And it's one of those things where I kind of had forgotten that that she is barely in it, and that she's like, her existence or her creation is a very important plot point, but she is not the main point of the film.
Yeah, the main point of the film is the monster, really. And
Yeah.
it's this kind of dual narrative where you have Frankenstein and Pretorius and the monsters sequence, and they inform on each other. And the structure of this film is really interesting, because you do get, so basically you have this opening. First you have the frame story, which I want to talk about
Right.
in a minute, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you have this opening that picks up right where the last film ended.
Yeah.
That kind of, shows everything. It's like, okay, Frankenstein actually survived, the monster actually survived. We're going to introduce Pretorius. We're going to introduce kind of all of the stakes of the film. And then you leave that completely and go to the monster for a large section of the film. That middle part goes on for a while. And then the other part of the narrative with Pretorius and Frankenstein gets woven back in when Pretorius goes and finds the monster in the crypt. And it's very weird because it's almost two different films. Like the tones are different, the performances are different. The only thing that really unites them is this aesthetic, this very gothic, very expressionist, very extreme aesthetic, and the fact that this is a Frankenstein movie,
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the bride, I do love the fact that she really does only show up for 3 minutes, and she's so iconic.
Yeah.
Like, we know she's as iconic as the Frankenstein monster. Like, we know that. We know the hair. We know the hiss. She doesn't say anything. She has no lines. She has screams and hisses.
Yep, and that's it. And then, just like all men, he gets rejected and decides it's time to die.
And decides to just burn everything down.
Just gonna burn it all to the ground.
Well, and you do kind of go like, in that last sequence, it's sort of like, okay, these men have obviously learned nothing about how to deal with, creating life, because you literally just created this brand new human being, right, who has just come to life with a brand new brain, and you don't ease her into existence at all. No. Like, it's not like, of course she's terrified. She's terrified of everything. Like, she's basically a newborn.
Yeah. But Frankenstein didn't want to do this anyway, because he's so horrified by his previous creation. But he's kind of forced into it because Elizabeth gets taken, and he knows that's the only way he can get her back alive. So he doesn't want to do it. And when he kind of is forced to, he's not like, well, all right, we're going to do this one the smart way. He's just, yeah. he's for a doctor, he's not very bright.
Well, and he gets sucked into it too. I mean, by the time he's at the point where they're actually creating her, right? He really is like, he's a full participant. It's no longer just about, what Pretorius is telling him to do, right, or the fact that Elizabeth is in danger. That's a lot of the tension for Frankenstein throughout the entire film, is that he wants to do this, but he's terrified of it.
Yeah. With
good reason, because, it has caused many problems for him and for the world, and is not a nice thing to do. What else did I want to talk about? Oh, well, I think in a minute I really want to talk about satires of the film, because both The Blind Man and The Bride of Frankenstein are so satirized in a lot of ways. But before we do that, I think it's interesting to kind of address the fact that this is a frame story. There is actually, unlike in the first Frankenstein, which just begins as, this is the story of Frankenstein, this actually has an opening with Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, in which Mary Shelley begins telling the sequel. Literally, she says, oh, there's more to the story, to Frankenstein. And it's something that gets ignored a lot, I think, in discussions of Bride of Frankenstein, because it's so odd.
Yeah.
There's so much that is odd about this film. And because it's never closed off, we never go back to Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. The story just keeps on going in some ways. So there's never this ending where it's just like, and that's the end of the story of Frankenstein. Right. And then, of course, you've got that odd double casting fact of Elsa Lanchester playing both Mary Shelley and the bride eventually, which has all kinds of interesting implications, I think. But I don't know. What do you think that the frame narrative works? Does it not work?
Here's what I find interesting about it. Because, like we were talking about, because the first movie varies so, like, it distances itself so much from the book, it's really, like, he doesn't die in a windmill at the end of the book, you know? And so it's funny because it's like it's basically putting Mary Shelley into the middle of the story and pretending like the first movie followed her story truthfully when it didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's just kind of an interesting choice. I do think it's weird that it doesn't get closed off, but I don't know. There's something about it I kind of like as as a way to introduce the fact that the monster didn't actually die. I kind of like hearing from the author, "Oh, but you didn't hear the whole story." So in that aspect, I'd say yeah, it works.
Yeah, it sets up that kind of fairy tale aspect, I think,
Yeah.
that Bride of Frankenstein has more so than Frankenstein. That this is a time that is being invented, basically. This isn't reality in some way. This is a story that's being told. And it kind of
Yeah.
eases the viewer into that. Because one of the weird things is that, now I looked this up, supposedly Bride of Frankenstein is set in 1899. I cannot for the life of me find any confirmation of that fact. Because I know that in the first film, I believe that there are cars, and cars were not ubiquitous in the Alps in 1899. So the styles are very bizarre. So you've got a lot of different styles. Like Elizabeth is basically dressed in pretty common 1930s style. Victor or Henry is dressed in sort of middle range. He's kind of the English squire almost. Again, this is all supposed to be taking place in the Alps. Right. And then you have Pretorius and some of the villagers who are dressed in much more 19th century style. So it's this really weird mishmash.
Well, and also, I mean, Mary Shelley died in the 1850s. So.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing, that then even if you're saying, okay, it's set in 1899, which I don't completely buy, I think it's set in the 1930s, especially when you take into account Son of Frankenstein, which is the third part of the story. Mm-hmm. But you watch it, you're like, okay, so wait a minute, so this is Mary Shelley in like the early 19th century, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about something that's happening at least 50, if not 100 years in the future. And that this is her conception of what the future looks like. Right? And it's wild. It's really wild when you sit down and like actually parse it out logically. Mm-hmm.
You can't think too much. Like, I mean, luckily viewers in 1935 didn't have Wikipedia.
But honestly, I think that's something that makes it work. Like, that's one of the things I really like about it, is that it is bizarre, and it kind of conditions you to expect some of this bizarreness because it seems so detached from reality.
Yeah, it kind of creates its own like place in time because it doesn't strictly follow our actual timeline.
Yeah, exactly. It's strange, and I think that it also sets up this gothic nature of what we're about to see. And both Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein and most of James Whale's films are really informed by this kind of heightened melodrama. And the Gothic nature of German Romanticism, of German Expressionism. He uses a lot of shadows, a lot of canted angles, a lot of sort of bizarre chiaroscuro, and a lot of just strange approaches to filming, right? That kind of make you feel like everything is a little bit off kilter, everything is a little weird. A good example even is just when we get Frankenstein into his bedroom, right, at his castle. And it's just the most ornate bedroom you have ever seen. No one sleeps in beds like that. No one, not even in the late 19th century in the Alps. Like there's just, that kind of style doesn't exist in reality. But it exists in this world. And then you've got my personal favorite character, who is just the most delightful creation, and I don't know where he came from or where he went, Dr. Pretorius.
Yep.
Played by the always delightful Ernest Thesiger, who did not have a very long career, but is really wonderful in a number of James Whale's films. He's great in Bride of Frankenstein, and he is hilarious, frankly, in The Old Dark House, which in some ways I think is like a sister film to Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And he's from another fucking planet. I mean, he shows up and he introduces this moral complexity. He introduces a lot of humor and a lot of camp and a lot of queerness. And that's something I want to talk about right now. So, Karen, I have said numerous times, this is a really queer movie.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Totally. Yeah, in a few ways. And I think there's sort of this and I mean, maybe this is unintentional, maybe this is just reading it from a 21st century point of view, but you know, like just the dynamic between Frankenstein and Pretorius is sort of this, like, they're creating life together, and there's just kind of this I don't know, there's just kind of this interesting element there to me.
Well, I think that is really deliberate.
Yeah.
And I think it teases out the kind of conception of the Frankenstein story to begin with, which is this whole thing about like, oh, I am going to play God, I'm going to create life. And it's like, well, wait a minute. We can create life. Like that's something that human beings are capable of doing through, you know, natural reproduction. That's what human beings do. Right.
Yeah.
So it does turn into this like masculine thing of a man, or in this case, two men creating life out of nothing, right? So not out of the natural order.
Yeah.
What I find fascinating about Pretorius, and this is something that I noticed this time around that I hadn't really paid attention to, in his first kind of scene with Frankenstein, he describes, right, the fact that he has been able to create life.
Yeah.
And he says that he did it in the natural way.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
He says from a seed. And he grew his creations, right? So Frankenstein has taken these pieces of dead bodies, right? And sewn them together and put a brain in them and created life that way. Pretorius is claiming that he grew his creations. The question that immediately jumped to my mind was, what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Because he's making this claim of like he's literally growing human beings, right? What does that mean?
That is a great question.
In this context, and of course it's never explained. We never see his process at all. Like we see Frankenstein's process, as crazy as it is, but we never see what Pretorius has been up to.
Yeah. Well, and he's also just such a flamboyant character too, and just so fun.
Yeah.
Because he's very comfortable with who he is, and not not aware of, or at least choosing not to care if he's being judged by anybody else either. And I love that.
Yeah, he really embraces the mad scientist, basically. Yeah, he's very like, and in fact, he says a few things to Frankenstein a number of times that actually are true. You know, he says at one point, you know that you're responsible for these murders.
Right.
So he kind of acts as this not moral voice necessarily, but this kind of voice of reality, and that all of these things that Frankenstein has been trying to deny and suppress in himself and say that it doesn't exist. You know, he even says, I want to forget all of this. And Pretorius is essentially saying like, you can't, because you've done this. You've created this creature. You are responsible for it. You are responsible for everything that you've done.
Yeah.
And of course Pretorius's goal is, and I want you to make more of them. But what Pretorius is saying is very true. Like Frankenstein is trying to deny this part of himself, and Pretorius is essentially like, but you can't, because this is
to embrace it.
Yeah. And I do think that that's where a lot of the queer reading comes in, is that you've got these two men who are saying that together they're going to create a perfect human being. Yeah. And then you also have all of these elements about Frankenstein literally leaving his wife on her wedding night.
Yeah.
To make new human beings with another man.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So you can't get much queerer than that. And of course, I mean, James, if you know the career of James Whale made a lot of films that were like this. He used a lot of camp. The Old Dark House is a great example of that sort of perverse campiness, and it's the way that you kind of get a lot of queer readings into cinema in a time, obviously, when you could not explicitly represent people as being gay.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly Thesiger is sort of the repository of all of that, because he has to be evil, right? You have to make him evil because otherwise he won't be acceptable. But he's so delightful and flamboyant and entertaining that you love it when he shows up, and you're really sad to see him go.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I love Pretorius. He is such a delightful addition to the entire story, because the rest of the story would be kind of depressing, really, if he wasn't around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. It would.
So what else did we want to talk about? Was there anything that struck you on rewatching this? Obviously, you know, I've seen this movie millions of times, and even now, like rewatching it, I was like, huh, I never really thought about that. So was there anything that struck you on rewatching it that you were very much like, oh, I didn't really pay attention to that, or I didn't notice that before?
I think, I mean, I kind of already was talking about that, just as far as just the way that it ties in better, I think, more faithfully, I guess, to the intention of Shelley's book. But as far as story elements, I think I just really, I don't know, I had an interesting, I don't remember really noticing that much about, which I don't know why, because it's kind of important, but like the couple in the beginning, they were the parents of the little girl that he had drowned in the first book.
Yeah.
I mean, the first movie. And they go, and because they want proof that he's dead, they want to know that he died. And the way that accidentally the father dies, but then he ends up saving the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like that just stuck out to me a little bit more this time. It's sort of this interesting like bookend to the story from the first movie, I guess.
Yeah, it reminds us that this is a sequel, and this is unusual. The idea of a sequel picking up literally right where the last one left off, is very unusual for this time period. When there were sequels, very often it was like, oh, you remember back when this happened,
Right.
you know, actually being like, oh, by the way, you thought that everyone was dead at the end of Frankenstein. Well, here's the truth, you know,
And
here's
not
what
just
actually
they
happened.
survived, but here's how they survived.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the only other one that I think fits into something similar is Dracula's Daughter, which is was made, I think, at 30, yes, 36. And it has a similar thing in that it literally picks up right at the end of Dracula. And in fact, Van Helsing gets arrested for murder. Which I just find hilarious, because he's like walking out of the castle, and they're just like, we're going to arrest you for murder because like all these people are dead, and he's like, no, it wasn't me, it was a vampire.
Yeah, I haven't actually watched that one. I need to.
Dracula's Daughter is again very weird, very queer.
Nice. I love that from especially those 30s. Like, yeah, love it.
Yeah, the Universal Monsters sequels are sometimes terrible and sometimes like actually bizarrely wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dracula's Daughter and Bride of Frankenstein definitely fall into that. And I also happen to love Son of Frankenstein, which takes place a good bit after the events of Frankenstein,
Yeah.
after the events of Bride of Frankenstein, because his son has grown up and he's Basil Rathbone. Uh, and but again, that kind of extreme aesthetic, that sort of, and that goes into this sort of idea of generational madness, generational trauma, and the sort of treatment of the monster as his brother, as someone that he's actually related to, because they were both created by the same father, which is all kinds. There's a lot of Freudian shit that goes into this stuff. It's just like,
it's great.
one of the characters I did want to mention really quickly, just because she's delightful, and I'm now seeing her in a number of films because she keeps on showing up in these Universal monster movies, is Una O'Connor as Minnie, the whose primary function is to be very cockney and to scream a lot. But I just think she's hilarious. She always like, I love it when Pretorius comes to the door and she's like, Pretorius? Pretorius? Dr. Pretorius! And it's so nonsensical. Like, why are you this fascinated by this man's name? But okay.
I mean, it's a pretty great name. I like saying it over and over again. Pretorius.
Pretorius. Pretorius. Yeah, she's great. Like, everything that she does is great.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my.
She's awesome.
So finally, I think that, maybe we want to talk about the fact that this is so iconic. We talked about how the Bride is so iconic, but in some ways it's almost hard to watch Bride of Frankenstein because we've all seen Young Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And Young Frankenstein takes more from both Bride and Son of Frankenstein, I think, than anything else. Like, it doesn't really take that much from the original film. It takes a lot from the sequels.
Which I think is part of what helped Bride of Frankenstein become the more iconic movie. Because it's the one that is more heavily borrowed from.
Well, yeah, and that imagery of Elsa Lanchester as the bride with the hair and the hissing and everything. Apparently she decided that she would emulate a swan. So the hiss that she does is her emulation of a swan's hiss.
Huh, interesting.
So she has all these bird-like movements. If you watch her performance, she's kind of jerking around a lot, like whereas the monster kind of lumbers.
Right, yeah.
The bride sort of jerks and kind of looks around really rapidly and moves really rapidly and suddenly. So it's very bird-like.
And she has kind of this scary stare too sometimes.
Yes.
So yeah. Mm-hmm.
She's just
like swans are beautiful, but they are terrifying. I got chased by one once. It was not fun.
Exactly. Swans are frightening creatures. They really assholes too. Yep. They're absolute jerks.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that in some ways Young Frankenstein has kind of spoiled Bride of Frankenstein in a lot of ways. I don't want to quite say spoiled because I love those films so much.
Yeah.
But so much of the imagery that comes from Bride of Frankenstein is there. Like Frau Blucher's character is very much Minnie. Mm-hmm. The way that she dresses, all of that stuff. Elizabeth, Madeline Kahn's performance as Elizabeth, is very much drawn from Valerie Hobson's. Mm-hmm. Do we want to talk about Valerie Hobson, who's just kind of injected there as like the damsel in distress? And she's actually a great actress. She was quite popular in this period, but she's just sort of like, what is happening here?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else to say besides that, but
well, that's where I think that's where you get this kind of injection of modernity. That she's kind of, that's sort of what she's representative of. She's the actual Bride of Frankenstein.
Right.
Just to point that out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, really, if we just step back from that, it's like, well, actually, the real Bride of Frankenstein in the movie is not the monster's bride that they create that's in the last 3 minutes, but it's Elizabeth's kidnapping that is the impetus for the story. So, she's actually very central to the plot. She's the one who, when they think Victor's dead, or sorry, Henry in the movie, when they think Henry's dead and they bring him home, she's there and she's the grieving, would-be widow, and then discovers that he's still alive. And for her, that's great, but it leads to all kinds of other trouble. And then at the very end, when the monster decides that he needs to die, he lets Frankenstein and his bride go.
Yeah, and that moment is so wonderful because, you know, the poor monster has been rejected by everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You do kind of want to be like, dude, give her a little bit of space. Like give her a
Yeah.
chance here. She just woke up.
Right.
Um, but yeah, that he ultimately is like, no, we are supposed to be dead. We belong
Yeah.
dead. You go out and live. And so it's interesting to see the monster's sacrifices ultimately for his creator
Yeah.
and for someone who has rejected him completely.
Yeah, it's a sacrifice for someone who does not deserve the grace of that act at all.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, and this touches back on more of who the monster is in the story in the original novel. He's a lot more aware. He's not this monster that's incapable of thought and understanding. He's actually very much capable of that. And it's fun to joke that, like, oh, he gets rejected and decides to burn everything down. Like that's fun to joke about, but that's really not what's happening at the end of the film here. This is someone who, after all is said and done, he understands that he was born from death and that there really isn't a place for either of them in the world, and that letting them himself and her go is the right thing for the sake of this young couple to go off and
Mm-hmm.
live their lives.
Yeah, and he's also come to understand love. He's come to
Yeah.
understand friendship. He knows what that feels like.
Yeah.
And he knows what that means. And he sees that in the future of his own creator who has refused to love him.
Right.
And then ultimately, yeah, makes that choice. And it feeds into this interpretation and view of the monster as being very identified with Christian iconography. He's, you know, when the villagers first truss him up, he's trussed up in kind of a cross shape. He stumbles through all of these graveyards. I always find it interesting that he knocks over a statue of a bishop, but doesn't knock over any of the crosses or crucifixes as he goes
Yeah.
along. And he's very much treated as this sufferer, right? And in fact, there's a sense, one part of the film was censored, and it was something that Whale actually had to take out. That was the monster actually falling at the feet of a crucifix with Christ on the cross, and recognizing in Christ a fellow sufferer. And that this was a scene that, like, they made him cut for fairly obvious reasons, but it was this deliberate identification of the monster with Christ and of the monster with Christian suffering, and that ultimately he chooses to sacrifice himself. And so that the people who are capable of creating life can continue to survive. So it feeds into some really interesting elements, I think, in the film.
Yeah.
So I think that could probably close this out. Do you have any last thoughts about Bride of Frankenstein?
Um, just that I love it and it's great and it's available on Peacock and soon on the Criterion channel. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And definitely, like, seriously, if you haven't seen it, even though we've just told you the entire plot, if you haven't seen it, please go see Bride of Frankenstein. It's such a good film. And it's an hour and 15 minutes. Like, it's not that much time.
Yeah, and it's
two episodes
really
of Ted Lasso. Come
yeah,
on.
yeah, and it's really well not this season, um, but it's just really it's beautiful and honestly like the black and white cinematography. I mean, obviously it was the 30s, so most things were black and white then, but I don't know. There's just this like crispness to it too. It really holds up well. It still looks
Mm-hmm.
beautiful.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous film.
Yeah,
It's gorgeously shot, and Whale really was a great director for that kind of imagery, and that combination of humor and empathy and pathos is just so well done in this film.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um, yes, I agree. Go check out Bride of Frankenstein, and if you have not seen the original Frankenstein, also check that out. And then if you can, watch Son of Frankenstein. After that, things get stranger and stranger. But definitely those three films I think are really good, all in their own ways.
yeah.
So So I think that will close us out for this bonus episode of Citizen Dame. Of course, thank you so much to our patrons. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for voting. And we will talk to you all later.
Bye.
She's alive! Alive!